All right, so today we are diving deep into something a listener requested, the shortcomings of communism, when it's actually put into practice. And we're using the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, and we've also got several prefaces they wrote, sometimes years, like literally years after the original text.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's like we get to see how their thinking changed, as they saw how their ideas were actually being used in the world. And, I think what's interesting is how those prefaces kind of show this tension, right, between like the idealistic goals in the manifesto and then what actually happened when people tried to put those ideas into action.
Okay, so let's start with the manifesto itself. So it basically paints this picture of like a perfect society, no class struggle, everyone shares everything, everyone benefits equally. Sounds pretty awesome, right?
Yeah, on paper, it does sound pretty great, especially, if you think about what was happening when Marx and Engels were writing. I mean, this was a time of like crazy industrialization, a lot of poverty, huge gaps between the rich and the poor. And, their ideas, they offered this radical solution, this vision of a world where all that exploitation and inequality would just like disappear.
But then reality hits. And things, they don't quite go as planned. When we look at places where communism has actually been tried, like the Soviet Union, China, we see this pattern of unintended consequences, right?
Exactly. I think one of the biggest contradictions is this whole issue of centralized power. The manifesto says that the proletariat, the working class, should take political power and control all the means of production, like the factories, the farms, everything. And the idea was that this would be temporary, just to get things going.
Well, didn't they later, advocate for a more decentralized system?
Yeah.
Like what they saw with the Paris Commune? I think I read about that in one of those prefaces.
You're exactly right. The Paris Commune was this brief but pretty radical experiment in worker self-governance. And it really fascinated Marx and Engels because it was so different from the centralized state power they originally talked about. I think in those later writings, we can see their thinking evolving. They're starting to grapple with those shortcomings we talked about. But let's get back to the centralization of power for a second, because that was a big deal in the original manifesto.
Okay, so back to the manifesto. They wanted this temporary centralization of power, but then what happened?
Well, what happened over and over again was that this concentration of power, which was supposed to be temporary, it just became permanent. Instead of going away, the state got stronger and stronger. And that led to a lot of problems. Suppression of freedoms, people couldn't speak their minds, and you saw the rise of these authoritarian regimes.
It's like the system that was supposed to get rid of inequality ended up creating new forms of inequality with like this small group of powerful people controlling everyone else. Kind of ironic, right?
Yeah. It's a pretty tragic irony. And, it's something that Marx and Engels themselves struggled with. We can see that in their changing views on decentralization and worker control. I think they started to realize that concentrating power, even in the hands of, a supposedly revolutionary party, could be just as bad as the systems they were trying to overthrow.
Right. Okay. So that centralization of power thing, that definitely backfired. But what about the economics? The manifesto talks about a society where there's abundance, right? Everyone has what they need. Did that actually happen?
Well, unfortunately, the economic reality in a lot of these communist states has been, it's been far from perfect. Instead of this abundance, what you often see is shortages. The economy just kind of stagnates. There's no real incentive for people to innovate or be productive. If you look at the Soviet Union, for example, they had this centrally planned economy. And, at first they did have some success, like they industrialized pretty quickly, but ultimately they just couldn't keep up with what people needed.
So instead of that overproduction crisis, the one Marx and Engels thought would kill capitalism, a lot of communist states actually had the opposite problem.
Exactly. They had underproduction, and they were constantly short on consumer goods. These planned economies, which were supposed to allocate resources efficiently, they often ended up being too rigid and inflexible. They just couldn't respond to all the complexities of a modern economy. They didn't consider things like individual preferences and the fact that supply and demand are constantly changing.
That makes me think of, those pictures of people waiting in these huge lines for basic necessities in Soviet Russia. That promise of abundance didn't really work out, did it?
That's a really good example. I mean, those shortages, they weren't just inconvenient. They pointed to a much deeper issue. These planned economies just weren't very good at predicting or meeting people's diverse needs in a large, complicated society. And in some cases, those shortages, they actually contributed to social unrest. People got frustrated. They started to question the regime.
Wow. So it's like, even when you start with good intentions, putting those ideas into action can have some pretty serious unintended consequences.
Yeah, it really makes you think, right? It's so important to look at not just the ideals behind an ideology, but also, what happens when you actually try to put those ideas into practice.
So last time we were talking about some of the, the big differences between what the Communist Manifesto promised and what actually happened when people tried to make those ideas reality.
Right, and things get even more complicated when we start thinking about the social and cultural side of things. Remember, the manifesto, it calls for getting rid of traditional family structures and national identities. They saw those as tools of oppression, ways for the ruling class to stay in power.
Right, but when people actually tried to dismantle those traditional structures, it often backfired.
Yeah, it definitely did. In some cases, the state, trying to reshape society, they ended up just imposing new kinds of control, and that led to social unrest and cultural repression.
It's like instead of moving towards freedom, they just swung from one extreme to the other. It seems like the road to, a fairer society, it's paved with good intentions, but that doesn't mean it always gets you where you want to go.
That's a great way to put it. If you think about the Soviet Union under Stalin, they tried to collectivize agriculture, right? They wanted to modernize the economy, but it ended up causing this widespread famine, and a lot of the peasants resisted. It's like, it just shows you that, trying to engineer society, even with, good goals in mind, it can have these terrible consequences if you don't think about the complexities of human behavior and cultural traditions.
It's kind of scary to think about how easily the desire for a fairer society can turn into something authoritarian and oppressive. And it's not just the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
Didn't we see similar things happen in other communist states?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like China, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao Zedong, he wanted to purge the country of all the capitalist and traditional stuff. But it turned into this period of crazy upheaval. There was violence, persecution. They destroyed so much cultural heritage.
It's just sad to see how these attempts to create a new society often cause so much suffering. It seems like the line between, liberation and oppression, it can get really blurry, especially when all the power is in the hands of one party or one ideology.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. One of the biggest criticisms of these communist implementations is that there was no room for dissent. There was no accountability. When the state becomes all powerful, it can just crush anyone who disagrees, and that creates this culture of fear. People are afraid to speak up, and that just makes it so much easier for those in power to abuse their power.
It makes you wonder if there's any way to achieve those goals like equality and social justice without having to sacrifice individual freedoms. It seems like this really tricky balancing act. And a lot of these communist states, they couldn't pull it off.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a tension that people are still debating today. Political philosophers, activists, they're all trying to figure out how to create a society that's both fair and free. Can those two things even exist together? Or are they fundamentally opposed?
These are big questions. But before we go too deep into the philosophy of it all, let's come back to the Communist Manifesto for a minute. Yeah. We're talking about some of its key ideas and how they played out or didn't play out in the real world. But we also need to remember that the manifesto, it wasn't just about creating a new society. It was also a critique of capitalism.
Absolutely. Marx and Engels, they saw some really serious problems with capitalism, especially how it tends to create inequality and exploitation. And honestly, a lot of those critiques still ring true today. I mean, think about the huge gap between the rich and the poor, the fact that so many people are stuck in these precarious jobs, the way corporations influence politics. These are all things that Marx and Engels were worried about, over a century ago.
So even though the attempts to create communist states in the 20th century, well, let's just say they weren't perfect, we can't just ignore the criticisms of capitalism that Marx and Engels were making, right?
Right. I mean, they had a point about some of the contradictions in capitalism and how it can lead to injustice. The question is, how do we learn from the mistakes of those communist experiments and also address the ongoing problems with capitalism?
So what do we do? How do we fix these systemic problems without repeating the same mistakes? Where do we even begin?
I think one thing that's really important is to realize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every society has its own history, its own culture, its own economic situation. So what works in one place might not work in another.
So no, blueprint for a revolution.
Probably not. Yeah. I think we need to focus on creating open, democratic processes where we can experiment, adapt, change course when we need to.
So more of an evolving thing rather than a rigid ideology.
Exactly. And that process, it has to be based on a real understanding of human nature, the good and the bad. We have to remember that people are complicated. We're driven by self-interest. There's always the potential for corruption. And those things can happen even in systems that are supposed to be about equality.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in these like utopian dreams and forget that any system we create, it's going to be run by real people with all our flaws.
Exactly. And that brings us to a question that Marx and Engels wrestled with, the role of the state. How much power should it have? What kind of checks and balances do we need to keep those in power from abusing their power? And honestly, these are questions we're still asking today, not just about communism, but about any political system that's trying to create a more just society.
It's a reminder that power, no matter who has it, it needs to be watched. We have to hold those in power accountable. And that brings up another point about individual agency, the fact that even those systems and structures, they do have a big influence on our lives. Ultimately, we still have choices. We can resist, we can innovate, we can make change happen.
I love that. That's such an important point. It's so easy to get lost in these big discussions about, revolution and system change and forget that real change, it starts with individuals, with acts of courage, with compassion, with creativity.
So it's not just about waiting for the perfect system to come along. It's about actively trying to shape the world we want to live in.
Absolutely. And that can mean a lot of things. It can be political activism. It can be creating new economic models like worker co-ops. It can even just be, calling out injustice when you see it in your everyday life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how the Communist Manifesto, it offered this really powerful critique of capitalism. But then the attempts to build a new society based on those ideas, well, they often fell short.
Yeah, but the conversation doesn't end there, right? The search for a more just and equitable world, it's still going on. And the things we've learned from this deep dive, the good and the bad, they can help us as we try to create a better future.
So where do we go from here? How do we take these lessons and apply them to our own lives, our communities? What can we learn from the people who came before us, the people who are fighting for a better world, even if their efforts didn't always work out the way they planned?
Well, now we need to look at the criticisms of communism itself, not just from the outside, but from people within the movement, because even those who agreed with Marx and Engels, they didn't always agree about the best way to get to that more just society.
Sounds like there's still a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, everybody stick around for part 3, where we're going to be exploring those critiques from the anarchists who thought we should just get rid of the state completely, to the social democrats who believed in working within the system to make change happen. It's going to be a really interesting ride. All right, so we're back, and we've been digging into the Communist Manifesto, right? We've talked about the big ideas, how they played out in real life, and, well, some of those unintended consequences.
And now we're getting to, I think, the most interesting part. We're going to look at the critiques of communism itself, not just from people who were, completely against it, but even from those who wanted the same things as Marx and Engels, a more just society.
Yeah, it's like we're going to see the debates and arguments that were happening within the movement itself.
Exactly. And one of the most fundamental critiques, it came from the anarchists. They basically believed that the state, any state, is always going to be a tool of oppression.
So even a worker state, like Marx and Engels talked about.
Right. The anarchists, they thought that any state would just become a new ruling class. It would be like trading one form of domination for another.
So they didn't want any kind of centralized power at all, even if it was in the hands of the people.
Nope. They wanted a completely decentralized society, one based on cooperation and helping each other out, but without any state control.
That's a pretty big difference from the manifesto.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The manifesto, remember, it's all about the state taking control of the economy. But the anarchists, they thought the state itself was the problem.
It makes you think about how, even when people agree on the big goals, they can have such different ideas about how to get there.
Absolutely. And those differences, they can lead to real conflicts, like what happened during the Russian Revolution, between the Marxist-Leninists and the anarchists.
Right. It's even when everyone wants a better world, they don't always agree on the path to get there. So, okay, we've got the anarchists, they want no state at all. Were there any other big critiques from within the movement?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Social Democrats, they had a whole different take on things. They didn't like the idea of a violent revolution, just overthrowing everything. They thought that was too drastic.
So they want to work within the system, try to change it from the inside.
Exactly. They thought you could use things like elections and labor unions to make things better, gradually reform capitalism into something more just and fair.
Seems like a more practical approach, right?
Yeah.
Maybe not as exciting as a revolution, but maybe more likely to actually improve people's lives.
Yeah, that was their argument. And they would point to places like Sweden and Denmark, where they have these strong social safety nets and workers have a lot of rights. And those things were achieved through democratic means.
So instead of tearing everything down and starting over, they wanted to build on what was already there and make it better.
Right. And, this debate between revolution and reform, it's still going on today on the left. It's all about strategy, what's the best way to fight for social and economic justice?
So even within communism, there were all these different ideas, different approaches.
Exactly. It's important to remember that, communism, it's not just one thing. It's an ideology.
We've talked about some of the critiques from within the movement itself, but what about the criticisms from people who just, totally oppose communism?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that in practice, communism has often led to, totalitarian governments, economic problems, and human rights abuses.
Yeah, we talked about some of those issues before, right? The concentration of power, the lack of freedom, the struggling economies. It's hard to ignore those historical examples.
It really is. And a lot of critics, they argue that those problems aren't just like accidents. They say that they're built into the very nature of communism. The idea that the state controls everything, that people aren't allowed to disagree. That creates a situation where it's really easy for things to go wrong, to become tyrannical.
But some people would say that those historical examples, they weren't real communism, right?
Yeah.
That the ideals got corrupted somehow.
Yeah, that's a common argument. But the critics, they would say that those failures, they're not just random. They're a sign that there's something fundamentally flawed in the ideology itself.
So it's a debate that's not going to be resolved anytime soon. But it's important to at least, acknowledge these criticisms and think about them seriously.
Absolutely. We can't just brush them off or pretend that the historical evidence doesn't exist. If we really want to understand communism, we have to look at both the good and the bad, the aspirations and the failures.
It reminds you that no ideology, no matter how good it sounds, is perfect. And that if we want a better world, we have to be constantly thinking critically, questioning things, and learning from the mistakes of the past.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's a really important takeaway from our deep dive into the Communist Manifesto. It's not just a history lesson, It's a starting point for a conversation about power, equality, the kind of society we want to live in. Those are conversations we need to be having still today.
Yeah, even though it was written so long ago, it still makes us think about the world in new ways. It challenges us.
Exactly. And as we face the challenges of the 21st century, the questions that Marx and Engels were wrestling with, they're more relevant than ever.
It's been a really fascinating journey exploring the Communist Manifesto, from its utopian vision to the critiques, the controversies. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And I hope that our listeners will keep thinking about these ideas, keep asking questions, keep having those conversations about the kind of future we want to build.
Because in the end, the fight for a more just and equitable world, it's not over. It's something we have to keep working towards every day.
And who knows, maybe by thinking about these ideas, by really grappling with these tough questions, maybe we can find new ways forward. Paths that lead to a better world, one that avoids the mistakes of the past, but still holds on to those basic human hopes for freedom, equality, and justice.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Keep those brains working, and we'll see you next time.